Hey folks. Hey folks. Hey folks. All right, let me get into some of your questions. I'm going to jump into things today. Really interesting week that we have had here. Let me start with a bunch of questions and try and pull them together. Hey folks. Welcome to the end of quite a week in American politics. We have Kathleen from Seattle here, and oh, oh, I can't pronounce that one. North Totowa, North Carolina. That's cool. Meridian, Idaho, Bedford County, Grapevine, Texas. Hey, my friends in Grapevine, Oswego, New York. That's a famous town. Metro Detroit. I've been reading about Detroit today. Detroit is a cool town. I guess you probably know that. Chicago, Missouri. I wanted to write a book about Missouri. Framingham, Mass. I visited Framingham, Mass this week. Chica, California, Lake Forest, California, Canada. You know what? I am reading a biography of Champlain right now. Fascinating. And we just got to the settlement of Quebec. Really, it's just crazy to imagine, at one point, one winter, they came down to 4 people being left alive. Crazy stuff. Colorado Springs and lots of Arkansans. All right, let me jump into some stuff here. And for the person who said, whatever you do, don't talk about Charlie Kirk because I don't want to hear anything about him, now would be a good time to go, I don't know, prep dinner or something, because I feel like I kind of have to talk about him, having not mentioned him for the last 2 days, because I wanted to hear how the story was going to come out before I made any comments at all. So let me start with what happened. And that is that on Wednesday, I believe, I get very confused about days, but Wednesday, I believe, a right-wing activist named Charlie Kirk was shot at a college in Utah and died from his wounds. And in the immediate aftermath of that, which it's a little ironic that last time I did one of these, I said there's one thing that I won't write about and I won't talk about, because never is it a good thing under any circumstances. And that, of course, was violence by guns, death by gun. And this is no exception. I mean, it's a non-starter, but it happens in the United States, especially. So what was interesting to me was what happened in the aftermath of that horrific shooting. And I don't mean for Mr. Kirk's family, who he has apparently a young wife and a couple of young kids, and family, I'm sure, elsewhere, for whom this is an unmitigated tragedy. But for the way that the United States looked at the Kirk shooting, because you have to remember that for 2 days, we had no information. And let me just say again, I always say this, but it's important to remember that anytime anybody is trying to get you to make a snap decision about something based on fear, unless your house is literally on fire, they're trying to manipulate you. And I always use as an example of that the kind of scams that your employer always warns you against, or your family warns you against. If somebody says to you, you have to do this now, or you're going to lose your Social Security, or your bank account's going to be compromised, or whatever, they are trying to manipulate your fight or flight responses. And this we saw in a really, really big way, because immediately after an event happens, we don't know. Even the first announcements that come out, you don't know. And you think of the times that in very famous cases, there has been real misinformation, either on the part of the perpetrator or somebody made a mistake or whatever. And you got to take a breath and see what's going to happen. So what happened is, in the immediate aftermath of this horrific shooting, the radical right doubled down on the idea that this shooting was by somebody, as they said, on the left. And once again, let me reiterate that in the United States of America, the vast majority of Americans are in the middle. they're in what we call the liberal center. And what that means is they believe in a government that will protect the rights of the individual to become whatever that person wants to be. So that usually means regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, promoting infrastructure, protecting civil rights, and making sure there is some kind of a rules-based international order so that we don't have to worry about going to wars all the time, as many countries do. I mean, think of a number of, I'm thinking of Sudan right now, for example. That's something that people who live in Sudan live with constantly, the fear of the roving wars, and we don't. And that's one of the things that that liberal center cares about. The right is the group of ideological people who are trying to destroy that democracy, trying to destroy that system because they feel, for a number of reasons, that it is it's oppressing them, or that it is corrupt because it's not Christian, or they feel that it's interrupted the natural hierarchies of things. The right wants to get rid of that system. Then there is the left, and the left has a similar critique of that liberal center, believing that it was formed on a system of laws and a constitution that was so poisoned by racism and sexism from the very beginning, and perhaps classism from the very beginning, that it can't really be redeemed. So it needs to be taken down and started again. And that's true of both the left and the right. Now, in the moment we're in this moment, they're very different. I mean, they're characterized by different economic and political systems, but that idea of attacking the middle is on both sides. In the moment we're in, the radical right actually holds an enormous amount of power. They have the presidency, they have the Supreme Court, they have control of the House of Representatives. A lot of them have control of the Senate. If they work together with those liberal Republicans in the Senate, they have control of the Senate as well. The left in the United States has virtually no power at all. And this is one of the things people always say to me is, how come you never complain about the left? And it's like, because the left really has no power. So what's the point? You know, that if in fact the left were doing to Americans what the right is, I'd be all over that, but they're not. So I'm not concerned at all. Um, So immediately, the radical right started to scream that this shooting came from the left. But what they meant was not just the ideological left. They tried to make that into everybody who was not MAGA. And again, they were screaming about how, and there were reproductions in traditional media of ridiculous stories, like the idea that somehow there was writing on a bullet that indicated that the shooter was sharing a transgender ideology, which is a lot to write on a bullet, I just have to say. I'm sorry, that was snarky, but come on. There are a lot of rumors out there, a lot of conspiracy theories out there. And when that happened, a lot of people who are again, liberals, or even those who slide, to the far side of liberalism toward the left, started to say, in order to defend themselves against these attacks, they started to lionize Kirk as a champion of democratic discourse, for example, that he was doing it right, as Gavin Newsom said. And that was a really interesting rewriting of Kirk's actual career. And that, to me, is a form of disrespect. If somebody has lived their life in a certain way, when they have most tragically been killed, the last thing you want to do is rewrite who they were. And if there was one thing that Charlie Kirk was not, it was somebody who believed in the idea of open and honest debate to achieve an outcome for the greater good. So let me explain to you who he was, because some people didn't know who he was. He was a 31-year-old activist for the far right, and he grew to prominence in the fall of 2016 after the election of Donald Trump the first time. And he was a college dropout. He'd been to, I think, a semester of community college. And the way he got attention was in, I believe it was November of 2016, he started a website called the Professor Watchlist. And the idea was to draw attention to people working in colleges and universities whom he said or who he said were indoctrinating America's youth and were un-American. Now, I had a personal stake in that at the time because I was one of the inaugural people on the Professor Watch List, and I've written about it. You can Google that because it went viral when I wrote about it way back there in 2017. But the idea behind that was twofold. One, it was very obviously a money-making scheme. And this is part of the radical right that we don't talk a lot about, the degree to which it is possible simply to warn people that there is, some great attempt out there to destroy America and give me money and I will fix it. There's actually a wonderful book that was written about the roots of that, and I'm afraid the title of it is escaping me right now. But this goes all the way back to the 1950s, to the idea that people would literally go to high school gymnasiums and say, I will save America against communism if you just write me a check. And it became sort of a right-wing grift. And it seemed pretty clear that this was at least in part what the Professor Watch List was about. I will monitor these professors, just send me money so I can do it. But the other side of that was to dox people. And doxing is a verb that means you call attention to people by using their names and usually their phone numbers and their addresses so that they are swarmed with hate mail and threats. And they become so frightened, they shut up. And that attempt to dox people was at the heart of the Professor Watch List. Now, after I responded as I did, I got taken off the watch list and I've been put back on it at some point. I didn't know where. I actually looked today to see if I was still on it because I wrote a letter tonight and I mentioned that. And I am still on it, but I came back. I was off for a while and then I came back. But and I was never terribly hurt by the watch list. I believe that he probably got my name from something stupid a long time ago. An article I wrote for a children's magazine that attracted the wrath of some people in the American South because I had defended Lincoln. Actually, it was a very, very bland piece of writing, and I had never ever been in any way a controversial teacher. You've heard me; I'm not controversial. And I think it was just an attempt to grab any names he could find before this became a thing. So, like I say, I wasn't terribly affected by it, but I have friends, a number of friends and acquaintances who were very badly affected by it. That is, their faces and their names, their employers and their home addresses were flashed on the Fox News channel, for example, and their lives were simply turned into hell. And that is not the way that one conducts debate, honest debate. And so this idea somehow that there was an attempt to rehabilitate him as this pro-democracy figure was just weird. After he started this, the Professor Watch List, he did in fact get a lot of investor money and began an organization called Turning Point USA, which attempted to attack what he considered left-wing indoctrination in all of education. And that, it became sort of a hostile thing for a while. I hadn't really seen much about it in a while, but then he took this to college campuses to sort of do this traveling show where he would debate people who disagreed with him in something called Prove Me Wrong, which was interesting because he was not a college age student. He was 31 years old when he was murdered. And it was a little, that's kind of weird. I mean, there's a big difference between a 31-year-old and an 18-year-old. And so I'm not sure how much longer he was going to be able to keep that shtick going. But the trick to him was that he was the person who really managed to wed right-wing activism to the modern social media world that younger people inhabited. So he was sort of in your face, and he was somebody that the older generation of MAGA really expected could go a long way in the movement because he was one of them, but he also connected with a younger group of people, especially young men. His language was incredibly inflammatory. He was racist, he was sexist, he was all those things. But he did seem to be able to draw this bridge that that other people had not managed to do. You know, you think about the right wing before him, it sort of seemed kind of nerdy and it didn't seem cool. He managed to look clean cut and make it cool, or seemingly to make it cool. So as soon as the shooting happened, there's this outpouring insisting that he was a target of the left, insisting that um, people who were not MAGA were celebrating his death. I didn't see that absolutely anywhere, and I was online significantly that day. There was an outpouring from liberals and most of the left. Maybe there were some people who thought that he was um, live by the sword, die by the sword, because he was quoted. There's a video of him talking about how if we have to have deaths to support the Second Amendment, that's fair because we need that to support our greater rights. And people posted that, but the radical right created this atmosphere that somehow people who weren't MAGA were cheering on political violence. And in order to back away from that, some of the people in that space started to defend him as being an exemplar of democratic values, which, again, I feel like if you have one thing that you should take with you in after your life on earth, it's how you presented yourself. You had all those years to do it. Why would somebody suddenly change who you were? I'm sorry, that was editorializing, but that has a lot to do with my theories of history. Anyway, so all this was going on. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, said that, blame this on the radical left, all kinds of stuff. Now, what happened was that today, the FBI had been seemingly posting more on social media than they were being able to find this person. And there's been a big hullabaloo about that. But this morning, it turned out that a young man who is at least now the only suspect in the shooting, a man named Tyler Robinson, a 22-year-old, turned himself into police and confessed to the crime. And that changed things in a hurry, because it certainly appears right now that Tyler Robinson is from a Republican family in Utah. He was raised as a Mormon, and he was deeply immersed in or appears to have been deeply immersed in gamer culture and in a division of MAGA called the Groypers. Now, again, they're still gathering information, but the important story here is that MAGA has a lot of splits. I've talked to you about that before. And there is a significant portion of the younger group of MAGAs who actually don't like the sort of centrism, relatively. I mean, he's not a centrist, but don't like the mainstream nature of people like Charlie Kirk. And so they have been attacking him in public now for a while. And the Groypers are a group that takes a version of Pepe the Frog as their mascot and follows a man named Nick Fuentes, who is a white nationalist who thinks that people like Charlie Kirk don't go far enough. And it appears at this point as if that's the group with whom Robinson is associated. So all of a sudden, we're in this really weird moment where, as somebody said, those influencers on the radical right have gone from the Old Testament to the New Testament in a real hurry. They've gone from, we're going to get all these people on the left to, let's pray for him, and, he will, let's hope that this sort of thing doesn't happen any longer. But I think there are some lessons to take from this personally. One of them that I hope we can really push on is stop making these fast assumptions about who is doing what, because we just don't know. I mean, literally, it could have been absolutely anything. And that's one of the things really to remember, that until we really know what's happening, you have to assume we don't know. It could literally have been somebody he cut off in traffic who got mad at him. And you just don't know. So urging people to take a breath is a good thing, but also recognizing that the radical right at this point is inciting political violence. They simply are. There's no other way to look at it. And a lot of people wrote to me and said, "Is this it? Is this, oh, come on, I can't think of the name of it now. Is this that moment when we go to civil war?" And, I can't believe I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, is this that moment? And what I would say to you is, once again, this is an extremely small group of extremists. In a moment like that, the thing that I'm trying to model is, don't rush to the worst case scenario. The more that you can sort of pour oil on the waters and say, "We don't know." Political violence is never okay. We don't know, we need to wait, because so many times something bad happens because too many people jump too fast. And going forward, I'm really hoping people might have seen what happens in an event like this when something as horrible as a shooting happens. And it turns out, just a few hours after, a few minutes even after, the shooting in Utah, there was another one in Colorado, a school shooting in Colorado, in which the shooter ended up, taking his own life, and 2 other students were wounded. And of course, everybody was traumatized. And in that case, that was also somebody on the far right. And you really have to understand what's happening in a society, and in order to do that, you have to look honestly about what was happening. And in both of those cases, those people appear to have been radicalized by the right. Now, it is certainly possible to radicalize people in different ways than that. But in this moment, we have a problem with the urging of political violence on the American right. And, I've talked a lot about my belief that that comes from the lionizing of the cowboy individualist myth. And, the initial relationship between the Republican Party and the politicized, National Rifle Association, or NRA, which was not a political organization when I was a kid. They used to come into our schools and teach us how to use guns. They're the first gun course I ever had. I think I was even a junior member at one point, because they were a gun safety organization and they wanted guns used carefully. That changed dramatically in the 1980s when they became affiliated with the Republican Party and really pushing big business, and especially the gun manufacturers and ammunition manufacturers, which are both very big businesses. And the Republican Party gets increasingly involved in the NRA, and the NRA gets increasingly politicized, until you end up with where we are now, where the NRA is not a huge player anymore. It went bankrupt a few years ago. But you have so ingrained the identity of guns into a certain group of people that they have become sort of a gateway into a political ideology. And I think you can see this through the use of gun imagery on Christmas cards, for example, which is, bonkers if you think about it. And certainly not something I grew up with, again, with guns everywhere, but nobody ever would have posed on a Christmas card with their children with guns. It simply wouldn't be done. So we do have this issue in the United States, and it's one that we all need to address. Obviously I talk about it a lot. But those are the lessons I think we should take from this moment, that this was a real attempt to take advantage of a horrific murder in order to score political points. And anybody who's trying to score political points off of someone's death is not going in a good direction, especially when they're going off before anybody has any idea what really happened. And the idea is to get people out there, get them angry, get their emotions flowing. And now that the news has come out that it's not what people thought, to let the thing fall away, and people are just left with the impression that some left-wing person committed this murder of this decent man, when that's really a misreading entirely of what happened there. So the more that we can say political violence is never okay, and in this case, it was certainly appears to have been a radicalization of a young man on the right, not somebody on the left, and recognize that that's the reality of what happened here. Now, while that was happening, we missed a lot of other things that didn't get covered in the media. And this is one of the things that really bothers me a lot when you get one of these flashpoint stories, is that, I tend to look at how is this going to play out in 150 years. And far more important in the longer term, I think, than the politicization of this murder is the fact that Russia invaded Polish airspace also on Wednesday, much earlier than the shooting happened, and invaded Polish airspace with 19 drones, some of which were armed, some of which were not. And Poland and their NATO allies managed to shoot down 4 of them. And the Russians sort of said, oh, it was a mistake, heh heh. But NATO and European allies say this could not possibly have been a mistake. And they recognized it for what it was, an attempt of Russia to continue pushing the envelope. Because for all that Trump said that he could end the war, Russia's war with Ukraine in a day, of course, that's not been happening at all every time that Russia meets with Trump. In fact, he doesn't accomplish anything and they escalate, which is precisely what happened here. Trump met with them on August 15th. He said, we're going to have an agreement. In fact, the Russians agreed to absolutely nothing he said they did. And now they have invaded the airspace of Poland. Why does that matter? I mean, it matters for many reasons, but why does it matter for people who might be sitting there saying, why do I care about Polish airspace? Because Poland is a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established in 1949. We are also a key signatory to it. It has 38 nations in it right now. Most recently, Sweden and Finland joined during the Biden administration. And they joined after not joining for all those years because they were so concerned about Russian aggression and Russians trying to move in to NATO territories. Now, the trick to NATO is that it's a defensive organization. And the reason that it has managed to keep the world relatively calm since 1949 is the threat that if any NATO nation is invaded, all of the NATO nations will respond. That's part of Article 5. Article 5 says everybody will respond, and that Article 5 has only been invoked once. And it's interesting because Trump complains bitterly about NATO, but the only time the NATO Article 5 was ever invoked was after 9/11. When other countries came to the aid of the United States. So Russia pushing into NATO territory by invading the airspace of Poland is pushing to see what will happen to NATO and whether or not the United States under Donald Trump really will do anything. Because Trump has, in his first term, said he was going to leave NATO. He threatened to do it in the second term. He's been very lukewarm about NATO. And when Poland called under Article 4 a conference after this invasion of their airspace, it appears at this moment that the United States ambassador to NATO didn't go. But at the same time, Trump tried to say, well, it might have been a mistake that Russia went into Poland. But this afternoon, the United States ambassador to the UN made a very strong statement saying that the United States would 100% defend NATO territory, seemingly trying to walk down what Trump said about it being a mistake. That was a very important thing that happened while everybody was watching the story about Utah, but there were others as well. The other one that I have been watching very closely is the Epstein story. Because for all that a lot of attention got paid to the release of the Epstein birthday book, which not only had that appalling image in it, it also had the reflection on a large check being exchanged from Trump to Epstein about the exchange of a fully depreciated girl, which you can see online. Or seemingly that's what it was about. The other thing, the story that came out before that didn't get nearly as much play was a very, very deep dive by the New York Times Magazine into the amount of money that passed through JP Morgan Chase because Epstein was one of their biggest clients or one of their most honored clients, most valued clients. And that story in which Epstein was moving money, significant amounts of money, at least $1.1 billion dollars through a certain number of accounts, and that was only some of the accounts, including two from Russian banks and a number of payments to girls in Belarus and Russia and one other country that I can't remember off the top of my head, Turkmenistan. Um, that the story of money always interests me, as you know, and that story has not dropped. Ron Wyden, who is a senator from Oregon, has been all over this story for a while, and he and his people were the ones who discovered that $1.1 billion transactions that were part of the Epstein finances. And he's been really pushing to get access to those financial files, for the Senate to get access to those financial files. And he wrote to the Treasury Secretary and asked for them, and Scott Bessent said not happening. Now he is really trying to push that information out of the Senate. He's really trying to push his people in the Senate to release that information. At the same time that Chuck Schumer stepped up and tried to force the Senate. Mind you, the Democrats do not have control of the Senate, but tried to force the Senate to take a vote on whether or not the Epstein files would be released. Those Epstein files and the money that they involved are going to be very, very difficult for the administration to hide, simply because it's a lot of money. It's a lot of people. There's more and more attention to it. And as I say, I'm really interested in the money and which is public. I mean, the story is public. The amounts are not public, but you can look, and I will write about it sometime soon, I suspect. The document that Senator Wyden, as I say, of Oregon, has released with a list of the people he wants to hear from. And so you can take a look at that if you're interested and see just how many people are so deeply involved in Epstein's finances. Because I think the finances are going to tell people a lot about who was involved in this very seemingly large operation. So that's something. Oh, as somebody asked about the flagging. Yeah, really interesting that JP Morgan Chase didn't flag the suspicious actions that Epstein was taking with the bank that should have been flagged until after his second arrest, his federal charges, and after he died in his jail cell. And then all of a sudden they found thousands, literally thousands of exchanges that they felt needed to be flagged at that point, after the horse had very much left the barn. So that's a story that I think is interesting. And another one is something that somebody asked, while we were paying attention elsewhere, the Republican senators invoked what we know as the nuclear option to stop Democrats from stopping Trump's appointees from going through. And that means, I hate the word the nuclear option because it sounds just horrific, like they're coming with, medieval canon. But in fact, all it means is there's a simple procedural movement to do it. And all it says is that these items cannot be filibustered. And so this is what first the Democrats did it to stop the Republicans from not letting any of Obama's nominees through. Then the Republicans did it so they could force through Supreme Court nominees without filibusters. And now the Republicans are doing it so they can approve Trump's appointees in batches. I think it's of 50. So they can just hammer these things through, taking away one of the very few ways that the Democrats in the Senate have been able to slow down what the Trump administration is trying to do. So you asked about that. That's what that is. And somebody else asked about the Supreme Court and what is possible to manage with the Supreme Court. And I one of these days, I'm actually going to write about a comparison to the Supreme Court of the late 19th and early 20th century that was overseen by the Chief Justice Melville Fuller. who was from the state of Maine, and we don't claim him with any kind of pride. He looked a lot actually like Mark Twain. They were often confused for each other. And sometimes you will actually see one or the other of them illustrated with a photo of the other one. And that court, the Fuller Court, which we know as the Lochner era court, handed down one decision after another that supported big business. It said that the states couldn't regulate grain operators. It went through this whole litany of people can't, the states can't regulate working hours. An income tax is unconstitutional because the state isn't that strong, but it's strong enough to go after one guy, Gene Debs. There were all kinds of things. This is the court of Plessy versus Ferguson that says separate but equal is okay. It's also the court of the insular cases, which are the cases at the end of the at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century that say that America, even though it doesn't hold colonies, I hope you got that look, it can hold territories that are unincorporated territories, which means that we get places like Puerto Rico or Guam that are part of America, but not incorporated into it. So that the business people who were establishing sugar plantations on those islands didn't have to pay tariffs, but the people on those islands didn't get voting rights, is basically what the insular cases were. Well, the reason I'm mentioning all those is because every single thing that court did has been overturned. Every single thing, with the exception of the insular cases, which is one of the reasons I'm not keen on the insular cases. It's like, come on, Plessy v. Ferguson. Do we really feel like the insular cases is all that different? But the reason I bring up the Fuller Court now is because, at that time, the Fuller Court was working as hand in glove with big business as this court is as well. But there was enough popular pressure and enough pressure from people interested in preserving democracy that they started to elect a lot of people who didn't like the Melville Court and didn't like what that court was doing. And pretty soon they put into the White House somebody who really didn't like what members of his own party were doing. And he started to change the makeup of the court. And it did not take long before the court began to uphold a new way of looking at the law. Now, it is worth remembering that the Supreme Court, by definition and by temperament, more often than not, has supported property and traditional sort of reactionary values. A lot of Americans looked toward the court after World War II, the Warren Court, which was deeply progressive, and think that that's the way the court has always been. In fact, the Warren Court is reacting to a change in legal ideology at the time, and it's a little bit of an outlier. But anyway, the Melville Fuller Court does in fact change and becomes, it starts to embrace the idea of the law that reflects reality and not simply precedent. The other piece of the Supreme Court that is worth remembering is that the Supreme Court, I always say that the framers of the Constitution were really, really, really into the Congress. And if you read the Constitution, there's the preamble, which is beautiful and everybody should know it. But then there's the first section, Article 1, and that lays out Congress and what Congress can do. It's pretty complete. And then the framers turn to Article 2, and they lay out what the executive branch is. And that's pretty complete too. But I always joke that by the time they got around to the judiciary, like they were all exhausted and it was hot in that upstairs room in Philadelphia. And they were like, oh, screw it. Let's just have a judiciary and we'll figure it all out later. And let's go to lunch. So if you look at the Section 3, the Article 3 of the Constitution, it doesn't lay out the judiciary nearly as clearly as it lays out Articles 1 and 2. And what that has meant is that the judicial system has largely fallen, as the Constitution suggests it should, under the Congress. It is Congress who set up the judiciary and how the judiciary works. Now, part of that has meant that the judiciary has not been expanded since 1869. Ulysses S. Grant was president the last time anybody expanded the court. And it has 9 people on it because that's how many circuits they had in 1869. We now have, I think it's 13 off the top of my head. It and the country is just a little bit bigger now than it was in 1869. There will be many ways to make the court adjust to the modern era, including perhaps a limit to how long somebody can serve on the court. Because once again, I always like to point out that before we had modern transportation and before we had the modern system of the courts, the Supreme Court justices had to ride a freaking horse around the circuit in order to do their jobs. So people didn't stay on the court all that long. It was really hard, physically hard work. Similarly, we didn't have modern medicine and we didn't have modern transportation. So this idea that Supreme Court justices are going to always be carried out toes up is a really, really new idea. Those of you who remember people like Sandra Day O'Connor, remember she resigned. Lots of people used to resign and go on to do something else. Either retire or not, go back to practicing law or do something other than being on the Supreme Court. So this, again, we're in this weird moment where the Supreme Court appears to be clinging like limpets to a ledge, and that's not a normal moment. So there will be ways to adjust the Supreme Court to cease it being such a radical right political organization. Now, that being said, let me leave you with some hope, because again, I can't, I feel like sometimes my only role is reminding you that this is our country. This is our democracy. And the people who were threatening violence over that horrific act of Wednesday, the horrific acts, because those school children are equally as important as anybody else who had tragic things happen to them that day. The people trying to politicize that are a small number of us. And one of the things that worries me is that I have seen countries, including the United States, stampeded into violence that nobody wanted. And at the end of the day, violence very rarely solves the problems of the people who are committing it. It's not to say that countries are perfect. There are times when good has come out of violence, and you can't look at the American Civil War and the end of human enslavement and not think that was a good thing. Or rather, some people can, but I'm not one of them. But if you are concerned about the rushing forward into a violent future, remember that most of us don't want that. We want to solve the problems we have in ways that are just and fair. And one of the things to remind people of is that everybody who rushes toward violence seems to have a romantic idea of it, that they're going to be some kind of a hero, and it's going to be short and it's going to be heroic, and I always point to the Southern senator before the Civil War who vowed to drink all the blood that was shed in the Civil War. He said it was going to be this wonderful little moment. Nobody was going to get hurt. The North would back down and the Southerners would start their own beautiful country. And look what happened. The country is still scarred from the Civil War, and the deaths and the casualties from that war were horrific. So one of the things that I want to impress on people is when individuals are trying to railroad somebody into violence by shutting off people's ability to stand against it, by shutting off people's ability to vote to change the system, by shutting off people's ability to talk about things by being doxxed, we need to push back on that, because they are literally trying to railroad a country into violence because they cannot get their way through the normal institutions of democracy that have stood with us for 248 years. So the degree to which we can continue to reinforce our democratic values, the right to vote, which is something I'm very deeply concerned about, both, the right to have democracy at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level, the more they are attacking that, the more we need to push back and reinforce that and reinforce the values of democracy. And one of the ways to think about that is that there are simply human values that Americans stand for: equality, freedom, equality before the law, the right to have a say in your government, the right to have equal access to the resources that you need to be able to create a life for yourself and your family. Those are larger principles. Those are not partisan, those are principles Americans stand on. There are partisan differences that we can hash out. You know what? We probably don't agree, any of us, on every aspect of American finance or of addressing climate change or of American health or any of the things that we need to do to face the 21st century. Those are simply the things that we work out through our democracy. But those first set of things, the idea that we have an obligation to support the guardrails of our democracy, those aren't partisan. Those are things we can all stand on. And those are things we must reinforce when people are trying to undermine them by convincing us, for example, that there was trans ideology on a bullet. You know what that was? That was the maker's stamp, which is TRN. It's a Turkish company. Or it was a specific kind of bullet, a training bullet. That's sort of, you have to be frightened of your trans neighbor because there's a case, not a casing, a bullet that's got etching in it. First of all, I'm sorry, I'll stop. But it's like, who etches a bullet? Come on. That's such a social media meme kind of crap. When you see that, remember that that's somebody trying to destroy our democracy, not somebody who is legitimately warning you about a real danger. And you're feeling all this fear and you're looking at all this craziness around you and thinking, this is it, this is our moment. It's not. So long as we insist on maintaining the guardrails of our democracy and putting pressure both on our electeds now that are in office and on the people who are running for office to change the way we talk about things and to reinforce those guardrails. So if you can help people to see what just happened to America in this week, the potential railroading to a place that a number of radicals want us to be because they want to overthrow our democracy because they can't get what they want under our normal rules, and say that's not what we want. We want to reinforce true American values and hash out our disagreements over the partisan issues in the way that we have done for the last 248 years with the guardrails that we have had then. And then we can fix the country and make it better than it was before, because God knows it wasn't working so great before. We have the ability and the opportunity to make it better. All right. I hope we are that's helpful. It's dark here. I don't like that. It's getting dark too early. And tomorrow morning, 10:30, me and Joanne Freeman, no clue what we're going to talk about, but we're trying to do those more regularly. If I had to take a bet, I would bet we're going to talk about political violence because she's an expert in that, and I've written about it a bit too. If you're free, come have coffee with us. And otherwise, I'll see you around campus, as they say. Thanks for being here.